Hey everyone, and welcome to Satisfactory News. In a video I made a few months ago, I mentioned a few alternate recipes, and I asked if you guys wanted a dedicated video about the best ones. And quite a few of you commented that yes, you did want that. So here's that video. Alternate recipes are a fascinating and unique part of Satisfactory that are often game-changing. Unlike other games, these alternate recipes aren't necessarily strict upgrades. Some are more efficient than the base recipe, while others are a bit more puzzling, letting you use them to get rid of weird byproducts or make use of an overabundant resource while saving your main resource for more important projects. How to pick an alternate recipe. Before I talk about the best recipes, let's think about how to make the best choice when you're presented with two options. Because outside of the standout recipes that I'm going to mention here, there aren't many that are objectively good 100% of the time. What works for you in the moment is going to be dependent on several factors. Number one, do you prefer resource efficiency, time efficiency, or power efficiency? Number two, are you content with your current production lines for certain materials, or do you think that you could tear them down and improve them? And number three, does this recipe create or use a byproduct in a way that interacts conveniently with my existing factory and recipes? Some recipes may not appear immediately good or bad, so examine them using your current knowledge of the game, and honestly don't worry too much. There are plenty of hard drives in the game, and you can eventually unlock every alternate recipe. The other thing to remember is that it's tied to what tier you're at in the game, so you won't have every alternate available to you right away. So keep that in mind if you're hunting for something specific. Evaluating recipes will also depend on what you find easy or difficult in the game. For example, power generation is always a priority for me, and I enjoy expanding my power grid, so I don't really care if an alternate recipe costs more power than the default. But maybe you hate creating power plants and you're always running out of power, so you prefer to find more power efficient recipes. Speaking of power, I will touch on the power efficiency differences, but just take my explanations with a grain of salt. First of all, I'm largely ignoring miners and extractors since their power usage will vary depending on which type of miner you use and if you overclock them. Plus, it's highly dependent on whether you're using just the alt recipes that I'm talking about or some other combination of recipes. Consider my power numbers to be a rough estimate, and don't be surprised if you get a different result when making your own comparisons for your gameplay. Very few alternate recipes exist entirely in a vacuum. Most of the best recipes in the game are the best because of how they interact with other alternate recipes. A certain combination of recipes may eliminate an entire resource from a production chain that would need to be shipped in from far away otherwise, or it may allow you to maximize a limited resource like oil to make a overabundant fuel plant. My final piece of advice before we get into it is not to stress too much about using the best recipes. Use the ones that make your life easier and the gameplay more enjoyable. Because remember, this is a single-player game, and despite what the game suggests about efficiency, you don't need to optimize absolutely everything unless you want to. So with that out of the way, let's start the list. I'm going to start with Tier 1, moving all the way to the mid to late game. Cast screws. This can be unlocked in Tier 1, and it's one of the best early game alternates, improving the production of screws. Making screws is truly one of the first annoying things that you encounter in Satisfactory, since you have to make ingots, then rods, then screws, and the rod step just feels like it makes the whole process way too clunky, especially when you need them for other items, and your belts get oversaturated super quickly. Basically, cast screws lets you skip the rods altogether and turn iron ingots directly into screws. The crazy thing about this recipe is that both the original and the alternate have a 1:4 ingot to screw ratio, so you're not losing any resource efficiency, you're purely saving on building extra constructors. In the early game, where power is one of your biggest limitations, this is a bigger deal than it might sound. It actually results in around a 40% savings in power, thanks to cutting out a whole step of constructors. It will also save you a lot of mental effort, because whatever factories you make using this recipe will likely be torn down and rebuilt at some point. Fewer buildings means less time building and tearing down, which can keep your motivation up to do more enjoyable things. This is a huge early game recipe, and I highly recommend rushing to discover hard drives to unlock it as soon as possible. But as you progress, you'll probably look to get rid of screws altogether through additional alternate recipes, or you're going to use different screw recipes that you'll find later on in the game. But for early game, this is essential. Iron pipe. This is available starting in Tier 3, and when you reach Phase 2 and can start unlocking Tier 3 milestones, your coal demand is going to be split between two very big things. On one hand, you've unlocked coal power and can finally automate power production, but on the other hand, you can start producing steel items to further your progress through the game. But what if you didn't have to spend your coal on steel ingots? Well, that's where iron pipe comes into play. This steel pipe alternate recipe makes them out of iron ingots instead of steel ingots, which eliminates coal from their process. The downside is that this recipe is quite a bit less efficient on materials, using around triple the iron that the default recipe uses, and it uses a fairly negligible 6% less power, so that's not really super important. But the advantage of being able to make steel pipes just about anywhere in the world is massive, especially if you need the coal for other things. After all, iron is incredibly plentiful. Coal is slightly less so. Unfortunately, steel beams don't have a coal-less alternate recipe, so you'll still need to use coal for those, and you'll probably want to since Mark III belts use them. Though, personally, I use this as motivation to breeze through Tier 3 and get straight to Tier 4, thus gaining access to Mark IV belts. This is a little bit of a tangent, but those require encased industrial beams, which also use steel beams. There's actually an alternate called encased industrial pipe, which uses steel pipes instead of beams. If you use the iron pipe alternate recipe, you can make those without any coal. Continuing from there, using those two alternates together allows you to build heavy modular frames with just iron and concrete, no coal. That whole explanation might have been a little confusing, but you can see why I mentioned that these recipes don't exist in a vacuum. They all work together. Molded beam and molded pipe. Sticking in Tier 3 and talking about coal, let's talk about some alternates for beams and pipes. While getting rid of steel ingots from beams and pipes isn't totally possible, as I mentioned before, the molded alternate recipes can give you massive savings in your steel. By adding concrete to the mix, which is fairly plentiful in the world, you can cut down on your ratios. Steel beams by default are 4 ingots to 1 beam, and the alternate cuts it down to just 2.6 ingots to 1 beam. Steel pipes are normally 1.5 ingots to 1 pipe, and the alternate cuts it down to 1 ingot per pipe. These are pretty massive savings, and especially at Tier 3, when you can unlock these, you're going to be saving massively on your coal and can devote more of it to power production. Speaking of power, there is a minor power downside, with molded beams using 5% more power and the molded pipes using 13% more power, but thankfully these numbers will be easily offset by putting that extra coal into power production. Pure ingots. Pure ingots can be unlocked in Tier 5. And pure ingot is not a recipe on its own, it's actually a family of recipes. Essentially, each ingot has a pure alternate recipe. These recipes are amazing for 2 big reasons. The first is that they are all significantly more efficient than the base recipes, costing a lot less ore. The other is that they use water. Adding fluids to the equation may seem like a downside, but it doesn't have to be. First off, water is one of the most annoying byproducts in the game, so in the worst case scenario, these pure alternates give you more options for disposing of that water. In the best case scenario, you can extend the resources in your world, which is essential for people who want to max out the game. Steel ingots don't have a great analog here, but it'd probably be the solid steel ingot, which is available at Tier 3 instead of Tier 5. Now, while it doesn't bear the pure title, wet concrete also falls into this category and is often the first choice when getting rid of excess water. If fluids are still causing you problems, I can imagine not wanting to touch these recipes, but you should check out my video about how to fix the fluids in your world, which should pop up as a card in the corner right now. Heavy oil residue and diluted fuel. These 2 alternate recipes unlock in Tier 5, and they are absolutely critical if you want to max out your fuel power plants. This combination of recipes feels really weird and unconventional, but trust me, it works out to having the best numbers by far. Ordinarily, heavy oil residue is just an annoying byproduct of plastic and rubber that you somehow have to deal with. But with the heavy oil residue recipe, you can turn crude oil into this byproduct directly. Now, why the heck would you want to do that? Well, because using the alternate recipe for diluted fuel, you can combine it with water to create fuel. It'll make more sense once we look at the numbers. 30 crude oil per minute equals 40 residue per minute. 40 residue per minute then equals 80 fuel per minute. With the standard recipe, 30 crude oil per minute just translates to only 20 fuel per minute. These 2 recipes allow you to quadruple your fuel production just by adding water and an extra production step. This line does create the byproduct of polymer resin, but since this is a solid, it's much easier to just throw it in the awesome sink as compared to a liquid like heavy oil residue. But you can go even further with this chain. And I would recommend combining the polymer resin with water to create fabric, as your sink value will go from 12 to 140, so you'll be getting a lot of tickets fast. Or if you need fabric for your factory, this is actually the only way to automate it. The standard recipe uses natural components that you have to grab by hand. I actually have an entire video dedicated to fuel where I talk about these alternate recipes and how I make the most of them, which I will have in the cards right now. In that video, I dive deep into how to use them along with some additional more advanced fuel recipes to create more power than you will ever need. Speaking of power, using these alternate recipes ends up taking about 50% more power than using the default recipes. That doesn't sound great until you realize that you are getting 400% the energy output. So I would say that's a pretty worthwhile trade-off. Silicon circuit board. Staying in tier 5 for a little while, when you start processing aluminum, you'll run into a lot of annoyances, one of which is the byproduct of silica from making alumina solution. Silica actually is used in a later step of the aluminum production chain in the production of aluminum ingots. And while you can use that byproduct to supplement a main source of silica, you might find that it's just easier to get rid of that byproduct and instead rely on a steady stream of a dedicated silica production. The reason for this is that there are fluids involved in this production line. The last thing you want is for the silica to back up in the alumina solution refineries and then back up one of the fluids, because that could cause issues that end up being difficult to solve. Whether you want to get rid of the silica elsewhere or you're producing it directly with quartz, a great usage for it is the alternate recipe silicon circuit board. The normal circuit board recipe takes copper sheets and plastic, while this alternate takes copper sheets and silica. Oil products like plastic are a whole other production chain that may be inconvenient to ship in depending on where you are. It also may take away from the oil that you'd rather use for power. On top of these advantages, it also consumes significantly less power, and you can see this without even doing the math. With the alt recipes, you're just using a bunch of constructors that use 4 megawatts of power, but with the default recipes, you're using refineries to create plastic, which each consume 30 megawatts. But if you do want to do the math, it's about 70% less power. And that's before considering whatever you choose to do with the heavy oil residue from making plastic. That's going to add even more power. My last note on the silica is that there is a pure aluminum ingot alternate recipe that is very good, and it removes silica from the recipe. So with this alternate, you'll need to get rid of it somehow, and the silicon circuit board is going to be the easiest option. Heavy encased frame. Now we're in tier 6. As I said earlier in the video, getting rid of screws from a production line is the goal of many players, since even with high tier belts, they can be a pain to move around given their large quantities. So it only makes sense that one of the best later game alt recipes is the heavy encased frame, which produces heavy modular frames. This recipe keeps 3 of the 4 ingredients the same, but replaces screws with concrete. Concrete, one of the most basic items in the game. Outside of that obvious advantage, it's also just more resource efficient in general. This recipe is more efficient than the base recipe, even if you use the steel screws alternate to make the screws. And you have access to alternates for basically every part in this recipe, and the parts that make them. So it's incredibly flexible depending on what other alternate recipes you have. Here's an example comparing a totally standard production line versus one that uses alternate recipes to make the process more resource efficient. This recipe gives you savings in power, buildings, resources, everything. In fact, it saves around 50% power, which can go a long way. And that's where I'm going to wrap it up. A lot of the super high tier late game alternate recipes are either not the most impressive, or they're so niche that they're not particularly worth discussing. But if you do have a favorite one that you like to use for the way that you play the game, please let me know in the comments below, because there are so many more alternate recipes in Satisfactory, and I'm not going to rate every single one of them here. Outside of a few objectively good ones like the ones I talked about in this video, most of the other recipes are incredibly context dependent, and players will have widely different opinions based on their playstyle and factory setup. So let me know what you're using, let me know what the savior of your playthrough is, and don't forget to like and subscribe because it helps a lot, and I will see you in the next video.